The Diplomat, 28th of March 2024, 3 fundamental aspects to comprehend China's hegemonic foreign policy. When we converse, a number of my international acquaintances in Beijing express growing perplexity regarding China's foreign policy. Desire to alter the status quo in the Asia-Pacific region? Is China employing Europe as a negotiating leverage against the United States? What is the origin of wolf warrior diplomacy? Their inquiries are ubiquitous and intriguing. However, obtaining introductions from Chinese scholars proves challenging due to their reluctance to engage with foreign media outlets. As an impartial correspondent, I believe it is essential to provide a concise synopsis of my observations regarding China's foreign policy during the previous decade. Since I do not represent the Chinese government, my opinion is undoubtedly not 100% accurate. However, I hope it will assist foreign analysts in comprehending Chinese diplomacy. South Global Diplomacy. China has a diplomatic custom of fostering amicable relations with developing nations, economically disadvantaged countries, and regions presently referred to as the Global South. For example, the Chinese foreign minister must visit Africa during his annual introductory visit. Why? This statement not only underscores China's status as a developing world member but also represents the country's diplomatic readiness for the forthcoming period and beyond. China's Global South diplomacy also includes fortifying ties with the Muslim world and Africa. China has been careful for decades to avoid opposing the views of Muslim countries collectively in multilateral forums. This mindset is nowhere more apparent than in the ongoing conflict in Gaza. China will abstain from condemning Hamas at the United Nations and other international conferences, as no Muslim nation has done so. Should the Muslim world eventually alter its position, China will adapt in response. Africa and Muslim countries constitute the 2 most significant voting blocs in the United Nations, contributing nearly half of the organization's membership, with over 50 votes from Africa and over 40 from the Muslim world, respectively. China depends on their assistance in many matters to enhance the protection of its interests. Human rights, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and Xinjiang, among other topics that Western nations raise for the United Nations discussion, will not affect the effectiveness of China's relations with African and Muslim countries. The fact that any Muslim nation in the world does not support the Western position on Xinjiang at present is a triumph for this diplomatic tradition. Houthi militants based in Yemen have declared that they will not attack Chinese vessels for comparable motives. As a result, China's foreign policy emphasizes diplomacy with the Global South. Thus, China is consistently courteous to minor nations. China's engagement with Muslim countries and its foreign policy in Africa are not merely symbolic gestures driven solely by economic considerations. China does have a long-term strategy. Great power diplomacy between the United States and China. Foreign policy is initiated domestically and encompasses economics as well as politics. Establishing a stable external environment conducive to economic development should be a fundamental component of China's foreign policy. Since the late 1970s, when the reform and opening policy was initiated, China has maintained its economic growth trajectory. This policy caters to the Western world rather than the Global South. Since its establishment in 1949, the People's Republic of China has been open to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. However, it has failed to generate sufficient economic benefits to foster development, and its citizens have remained extremely impoverished. In an astoundingly brief period, China's entire economy has transformed since it adopted a market economy and attracted foreign investment following its opening to the West. Hence, China places significant emphasis on fostering diplomatic ties with Western powers, including Europe, the United States, and Japan, to preserve an unrestricted economic climate, a fundamental condition for achieving sustainable development. As an illustration, China is actively pursuing the endorsement of a Science and Technology Agreement, STA, with the United States and a Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, CAI, with Europe. Because these powers can directly affect China's economy, I am significantly in favor of this type of great powers diplomacy. Regardless of the political challenges that may arise between China and the West, China will make every effort to sustain stable economic relations. In contrast, the foundation of China-Russia relations primarily consists of reciprocal political support. Undoubtedly, China pursues energy and economic cooperation, albeit primarily as a preemptive measure for the future. A conflict in the Taiwan Strait would profoundly impact the diplomatic and economic ties between China and Western nations. China would be ill-equipped to shoulder the repercussions on its own. Energy and agricultural products from Russia would provide China with a dependable backup. According to some Western analysts, a new axis consisting of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran has been postulated. I consistently assert that China distinguishes itself from other nations by openly opposing the West. In fact, it constitutes a fundamental component of the survival strategies of North Korea, Iran, and Russia. China's situation is entirely different. It must maintain an open policy with Western powers to assure the social development and livelihoods of 1.4 billion people. Although China's diplomatic approach towards the European Union, Japan, and the United States is not politically pragmatic, the Chinese government's behavior is motivated by the welfare of the general public. North Korea will never imitate China, and Chinese citizens will never support a foreign policy that has severe ties with the West. Regardless of how anti-American an individual may appear to be, a Chinese person has no desire to reside in North Korea. Contemporary diplomacy. Currently, the greatest concern of many Western nations is that China will unilaterally alter the status quo, including in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. Since both parties believe they are correct and there is no consensus, this is a significant issue. The Chinese government believes that certain Western nations have encircled China through their intervention in regional territorial disputes, an action that contradicts the international order commanded by the United Nations. Beijing considers China's territorial claims to be to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and not to occupy the land of others. Nevertheless, Western nations believe China's position disrupts the established international order and undermines the status quo. In their opinion, China is attempting to occupy territory that is not its. When viewed in this manner, the presence of Western nations in the region serves to preserve international peace and order. In light of this context, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy emerged globally. Although I wouldn't say I like this design on a personal level, I can appreciate its rationale. This is because the West exerts considerable pressure on Chinese diplomacy. Consider the following analogy: an individual who frequently loses their temper must be internally apprehensive and tense. The cause of China's concern is self-evident. At least 7 of China's neighbors are embroiled in territorial or maritime disputes, and the West is progressively more involved in each one, always siding with China's adversary. This undoubtedly exacerbates China's apprehension regarding its external relations. China is mitigating the risk in 2 ways, by preparing for a military confrontation and attempting to achieve a diplomatic breakthrough. This is reflected in wolf warrior diplomacy, also known as New Style diplomacy, which consists of vying with the West for the privilege of communicating on an international level. An additional, albeit underappreciated, component of this approach is that China supplies the international community with more public products. Beijing hopes that by doing so, more nations will recognize its benevolent intentions and abandon the China threat hypothesis. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which was introduced in 2013, serves as an illustration of China's New Style diplomacy. China endeavors to contribute to global public welfare in a manner analogous to the Official Development Assistance, ODA, extended by Japan. Furthermore, China is engaged in diplomatic endeavors in the Middle East, including mediating the dispute between Iran and Saudi Arabia and organizing a peace conference in the region. China has also proposed a community with a shared future for mankind in recent years. These ideas adhere to the global framework established by the UN Charter. It is comprehensible that the West would find China's New Style diplomacy unsettling. Its primary objective is to refute the narratives propagated by the West regarding China. Conversely, the expansion of China's military is exacerbating their animosity and strain. Although I am uncertain about the most effective approach to resolving territorial disputes and diffusing these tensions, maintaining diplomatic engagement fosters profound comprehension.